Now with Parag Khanna. He is a senior research fellow at the New America Foundation and the director of the foundation's Global Governance Initiative. Parag Khanna is also the author of the book The Second World: Empires and Influence in the New Global Order. This book is a picture of the 21st century geopolitical world order. Mr. Khanna, in your book, you are going to argue that in the near future we'll see a world made up by three new kind of empires or superpowers: China, the EU, European Union, and the USA. How will these three powers compete about influence in the rest of the world?
States already are superpowers, and the definition of that is that they have influence all over the world. When you travel in Latin America or in Africa, you see that China is already one of the largest investors there. China is responsible for much of the economic growth in Argentina and in Nigeria and South Africa because it buys so much of their goods and natural resources. So I think they already are, all three of them, superpowers. The EU is the largest economy in the world. It's the largest foreign investor in the world, larger than the United States. The United States, of course, has the largest, most globally dispersed military. So if you look at the combination of military power, economic power, and diplomatic influence, you see that these are really the three main superpowers in the world.
How can the European Union act as an empire or as a superpower with no common foreign policy and no security policy? Do we have to think in completely new ways of global power?
Absolutely, and the whole purpose of the European Union is not to be the historical model of a single central hierarchical empire. The European Union is very different. It's a network institution. Its foreign policy is its expansion. Its growth from 6 to 12, now 27 members is foreign policy, and it's the most successful foreign policy in the history of the world, is the expansion of the European Union, without a doubt. I think Switzerland should maybe consider joining one day. It kind of looks like a little donut there with a hole, but it doesn't have to have a common foreign policy. If you look at the issue of migration from North Africa, it's an issue that is of Italian and Spanish and French concern more than an issue of, say, Danish or Swedish concern. So Spain takes the lead. Spain helps the immigration ministers of West Africa to professionalize their border management. It does it on behalf of Europe, even though one country is taking the lead. New oil pipelines from Algeria and Tunisia and Libya go to Italy and France. They go to the common European gas market, not just to Italy and Spain and France. Again, it serves all of Europe. So it is literally a common policy rather than a united foreign policy. And I think that's the mistake people make when they look at Europe. They're looking for that one phone number that Kissinger was asking about 30 years ago. But you don't need to have one phone number.
You did a lot of your research while you were traveling, and not to these new superpowers, but to the periphery of the world. What did you learn about geopolitics, for instance, in Central Asia?
I think, Central Asia is the very heartland of geopolitics. The very field was almost invented to answer the question of who would control Central Asia and how. And today, it is very much the place where geopolitics is being reborn or coming back to life. You see that Russia's influence in the former Soviet republics of Central Asia is fading, while Chinese influence is growing. And how is China doing it? Not by military conquest. It's doing it by building railroads, oil pipelines, trade relationships, sending merchants and Chinese diaspora over the borders. That is how Chinese influence is growing in Central Asia. The United States is using a traditional military approach because it's a landlocked region. So the U.S. has a network of military bases there as well. So you see Russians, Chinese, Americans, all very active in this region. And the geopolitics is really up for grabs.
Historically, multipolar settings have been a major threat to peace. Do we live in a dangerous century?
We do, and it's more dangerous than the last time there was real multipolarity in the 20th century, even the 19th century. Remember that every time there's been multipolarity in the past, that we've been studying it and have a theoretical framework for it, it's been European powers. Today, you have non-European superpowers or great powers, such as China, India, and others, Brazil as well. So you really have to think about the geopolitics as being much more complicated. But rather than multipolarity or competing poles of power, I like to think about spheres of gravity. I like to think of these empires as having their own gravitational pull and attracting countries towards themselves. And that's where the competition is in the second world countries, to get them into one sphere of influence. It doesn't mean that there has to be violence, but if you look at the countries where the United States and China, for example, disagree on policy, North Korea, Myanmar, Uzbekistan, Venezuela, Sudan, Iran, that's a list of real hotspots in the world, and one can very well imagine that conflict may take place.
How does the picture you draw in your book relate to the concept of globalization? Will globalization be replaced by a new form of imperialism?
No, globalization is a way in which imperialism and geopolitics play out. We tend to think of globalization in the way that Thomas Friedman describes it, which is this benign force that takes place above everything else and envelops everyone equally. That's not true. Globalization happens because empires want it to happen. There is an American globalization, there's a European globalization, there's a Chinese globalization, there's an Indian globalization. The reason why globalization is so intense is not because of some neutral force. It's very intense because the powers that can afford to expand their influence, to sell their goods, to attract resources and buy resources, are those powerful empires that I talk about in my book. So it's not a coincidence. So it's not that geopolitics is replacing the old globalization. The new globalization is the new geopolitics at the same time.
Mr. Khanna, you bring a very specific perspective into a symposium that is mainly about business and economics. How do you like the atmosphere here and the exchange of ideas with people from different backgrounds?
I think it's very exciting. I think one of the great advantages here is that it's intergenerational. There's young people and old people. Students are very much involved in the dialogue, and I think that's one of the most important things, is to get the difference in perspectives, not just from business versus government or academia, but also between older people and younger people. And I think that this symposium accomplishes that better than any other.
All right. Thank you very much for this talk.